I'm going to start, although our third speaker is not there yet, because we have a couple of announcements anyhow before we actually start. Welcome everybody. My name is Rutger Klaassen. I'm the project leader of the ERC-sponsored project, the Business Corporation as a Political Actor in Utrecht University. This project is running with, besides me, Philip, Chi and Tully, who are here today, and Barbara, PhDs and postdocs on the project. We're organizing a series of events online. This is the fourth one. We started in February. We had already some great discussions, and we're very much looking forward to the discussions today. A couple of announcements. First of all, we are going to continue our seminar series with a seminar that will be on the 3rd of June, and Tully will say a couple of sentences about that.
Yeah, so as some of you know, one aspect of our project is comparative. So we're interested in broader questions of comparative economic philosophy. Most of the literature on the political theory of the firm is very Western-centric. So we're trying to develop dialogue among different perspectives from different philosophical traditions to kind of broaden the literature and the framework of questions about the firm as a political actor. To what extent is it an object of philosophical scrutiny in other traditions, such as Confucianism or the Islamic tradition, or different versions of African philosophical thought? How do those traditions frame the understandings of political legitimacy for economic actors in general? So those are some of the questions that our seminar on June 3rd is going to deal with, and that will be from 2 to 4 p.m., 1400 to 1600 our time, Amsterdam time. And the speakers who will participate, there are 3, are Joseph Chan, who is a professor of politics and public administration in Hong Kong and a leading scholar of Confucianism. Professor Grivas Kayange, who teaches in the philosophy department at the University of Malawi, and is an expert on African political thought and applied ethics. And Professor Timur Kuran from Duke University, who is a leading scholar of economic and political history of the Middle East and the firm and related questions in the Islamic tradition. So we hope all of you can join in. That's June 3rd from 1400 to 1600 our time.
Okay. In September, we will be organizing a subsection at the Manchester Workshops in Political Theory. You can still apply for that. Chi?
Yeah, so we are organizing a Mansep workshop for political theory of the Business Corporation this year. The workshop will be held online in the second week of September. So we will have some amazing and intensive discussions about different topics of the Business Corporation. So please consider submitting an abstract if you're interested. And please also help us to circulate the call for papers to anyone you know who might be interested. I'll post the link of the call for paper in the chat. Thank you.
Okay. And then next fall, we're also going to continue and have already invited and have acceptances from a number of very nice speakers for seminars in the fall. In September, we'll be talking about corporate governance in the EU and the US. In October, we'll have a seminar on Kant and Hegel on the corporation. Then in November, new corporate forms like the Benefit Corporation. And then in December, a book workshop around Jean-Philippe Robet's book on property, power, and politics. But I'm going to skip further details because I think it is good to get to business for today. And the details of this will follow in our network briefing that you will receive in your email. Today, we're going to talk about corporate finance in the corporation. So we're going to look at current practices of corporate finance and to what extent they have normative implications for corporate governance. Think about the kinds of investments and financial behavior that the shareholder paradigm has put upon corporations and whether that is problematic, and if so, what we can do about that. At least that was the blurb that we sent to the speakers, and we have 3 distinguished speakers that are going to talk. First of all, Lisa Herzog, who is Associate Professor at the Faculty of Philosophy and the Center of PPE at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. She works at the intersection of political philosophy and economics and has published on the history of political and economic ideas, normative issues around markets, ethics in organizations, and political epistemology. She will first talk, then after that, Jerry Davids will take the floor, who's the Gilbert and Ruth Whitaker Professor of Business Administration at the Ross School of Business and Professor of Sociology at the University of Michigan. His research is concerned with corporate governance, finance and society, and new forms of organizations. He has published widely in management, sociology, and finance. He is now based at Stanford for the year, so it's 6 a.m. where he is, and that is also true for our third speaker. And I just saw him pop up and come in. Welcome, John Cioffi. Do I pronounce that correctly?
Cioffi. Thanks.
Who is based at the University of California, Riverside as Associate Professor of Political Science, the author of Public Law and Private Power, the Comparative Political Economy of Corporate Governance Reform in the Age of Financial Capitalism. Who has published widely also on comparative law and regulation with a focus on comparative political economy of corporate governance, financial regulation, and labor relations. The idea is that each of the three speakers will speak for 20 minutes maximum. So please stick to the time. If not, then I'll warn you that that time is up, and then we have a full hour for discussion with the audience. Very much looking forward to this. We're really grateful you all accepted the invitation, and the floor first of all goes to Lisa.
Thank you very much. Nice to be with all of you here, if only digitally. So we got these three questions. What kind of investment and behavior does the shareholder paradigm demand from corporations? Why is it problematic? And how can we rethink the way in which corporate behavior is driven and assessed by the capital market so that corporations can conform to some normative standards that society demands from them, such as, for instance, sustainability or human rights protection? And when I got these questions, I sort of immediately jumped to another question, which I think these questions sort of presuppose, which is, well, what kind of animals are corporations and how do they function between well, numbers and talking, if you like? So these different modes of governance that have to do with numbers and that have to do with dialogue and discussion, deliberation, maybe even. And so I have some still rather raw thoughts about the relation between financial incentives and deliberations within corporations, which I hope will be helpful for thinking about the relation to financial markets. The chapter that was circulated is about financial markets as they currently exist and how they could maybe be made better, but that didn't seem directly related to corporations. So I thought I'd rather talk about something else here. When we talk about corporations being in some way influenced by financial markets, we are very much talking about a kind of governance that takes place in terms of numbers. Some numbers go up or down, and then this has implications for things that happen in the firm, decisions about costs, investment, whatever. And when one has these kinds of forms of governance by numbers, one runs into a practical problem on which there is a whole literature on its own about the problems that this can create. And I guess many of you will be familiar with the term Campbell's law or Goodhart's law. It has two kinds of names apparently, but the idea is simple and you'll all recognize it even if you haven't heard these names. Namely, if you try to govern some kind of social process through numbers, which may only imperfectly capture what the processes are about, then you'll distort these practices and you might also invite manipulative behavior with regard to these indicators. Campbell's original example was that of a police station where someone had the idea of evaluating police people according to the relation between the number of cases they resolved and the total number of cases that came in. And what would you do if you were a maybe underpaid police person whose bonus depends on that fraction? Well, you try to get in as few cases as you can, maybe tell people, well, this wasn't really a crime. You work on the cases first that are easiest to resolve because then you get your numbers up. And you might not be willing to invest a lot of time in complicated cases. And this TV series, The Wire, has lots of interesting examples of how police governance actually really in practice gets distorted by these kinds of governance issues. And in corporations, capital law problems are everywhere, because in a way, I mean, the larger the corporation, the greater the problem, because usually each division gets some kinds of incentives based on indicators about what they are supposed to do. So the pressure that financial markets create on firms gets translated into these other pressures. So I don't know, you cut 20% of your costs, in the other division you cut 30%, whatever. But it's always then leading to this governance by indicators that comes with its own problems. And if you think about the extreme version, or sort of the logical extreme to which you could take this, everyone in a corporation then becomes a kind of optimizer along some kinds of indicators. Together, somehow this whole entity is supposed to optimize the value of shares on the stock market, and nothing whatsoever has anything to do with meaning or purpose or human intentions as we usually know them. And if you then wanted to indicate any kind of ethics or any values into that system, you'd also have to do this through translation into numbers, but you would have to anticipate that people would only follow them in the way that the indicators force them to, and they would never be intrinsically motivated to really do something for the right reasons, as it were. Now you might say, it doesn't matter, we don't need to be Kantians here, as long as the consequences are good, it doesn't matter what people's motives are. But I think this problem is deeper, because there are really questions about the extent to which that kind of governments can deal with the kinds of problems that corporations face. You might say this is exaggerating, and this is really just an extreme, and we have the kind of financial pressures that come from financial markets as a kind of side constraint on corporations, why they could still pursue other purposes like producing socially useful goods, and they could also still pay attention to other side constraints such as legal constraints. And it is actually quite interesting that in this literature on indicators and so on, one finds some quite interesting case studies on how a strong professional culture can actually work against this kind of Campbell's law issue. So there's a wonderful case study by an ethnographer called Johanna Magler on not a corporation, but state prosecutors in South Africa who are completely governed by numbers, but they have such a strong professional ethos, and they are so much reinforcing this. And also when people are promoted, it's really the ethos and not the numbers alone that counts, that they manage to be governed by numbers and yet also be intrinsically motivated to do the right thing. So maybe there could be that kind of model for corporations, but that would then presuppose that you have this strong counter ethos, if you like. It raises questions about how that could come about. And to be honest, I think I would have my doubts about the kinds of purpose noises that corporations have recently made, which are just using this as a kind of smoke screen. I don't think you can build a strong professional culture or any kind of strong culture around notions of purpose that are as thin as the ones we see in the corporate world. I mean, there are exceptions, but the sort of the big purpose talk, that doesn't seem to be the kind of thing around which you could really build a strong institutional culture that would then prevent these kinds of Campbell law problems from happening. So even sort of the good kinds of investment criteria, I think, have to face this problem. So in recent years, you have lots of green investments. The EU is now trying to define sustainable investments. So the idea here is that you integrate social values into financial market indexes. Of course, this needs to happen then also in combination with regulation, because legal accountability, because otherwise they could just claim to have these kinds of criteria fulfilled. But here is a concrete example that I recently heard about when it comes to these kinds of green assets. So sounds like a good idea. Let's have these green financial products. What does the guy in the corporation who's responsible for financial market relations do? He starts calling people who do some kind of sustainability projects to find out what the company is already doing in order to put this into this investment vehicle in order to get cheaper money from financial markets. And that's a real life case that I heard about. So the idea that you would govern and sort of infuse certain values through financial markets into corporations, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it will always only happen in the way in which people can optimize on the indicators that really matter in their division and for their bonuses and so on. And so in this particular example, instead of investing in additional green projects as these financial tools were meant to provide incentives for, the people in the company just said, well, do we have something we can put into this, relabel it without changing any real behaviors? So the question then becomes, well, what are really the alternatives? And I mean, on a psychological level, it's of course very useful if you have the market as some kind of anonymous force to bring bad news. It's almost as good as external consultancies, or maybe even better from the perspective of management. And I think there is something very tempting for corporate leaders to always be able to point to the market and what the market is doing in order to make certain decisions that would otherwise be unpopular. But that's just kitchen psychology. And I think in substance, the real question here is, if we assume that there is some way in which corporations need to be held accountable, and if we think that financial markets are not doing a very good job and they are not getting this alignment with societal values that they're not getting this right and there are always Campbell Loss problems, then what would be a good way of creating accountability? And I think actually, I think sort of the case against financial market-driven corporations can really be served by coming up with good answers to that question, because there's always a worry if you say, oh, let's just get rid of financial investors in some way or other, and let's just do this with loans from banks or whatever. What you often get as a reaction is, but who's going to make sure that the company will really held accountable? What about telling people that certain business models just don't work and so on? So this kind of reality check that, according to theory, comes from financial markets, and reality often doesn't, but we need some alternative for that, then we can make a stronger case against financial markets, I would say. And when you start thinking about this, one strategy could be to look at how other private or public or semi-private institutions deal with this challenge. And some of them have pretty sophisticated systems of various boards, checks and balances. Certain groups get a right to information, others have a right to veto certain things, and so on. For example, hospitals, some of them have really complex governance structures, or insurance companies and so on. It seems that this is what we should then look for corporations. And the hope would be that somehow such models could overcome these Campbell Law issues, because they would function much more in a sort of discursive mode, really discussing things instead of just looking at numbers and not having to give any kind of justification for how you got to the numbers. And I mean, one indication that this should be possible is that in Denmark and Germany, there are actually quite a few companies that are, from the outside, you wouldn't be able to tell this, that they are actually owned by foundations, and they stand in a kind of dialogical relation with the governance body of the foundation. And of course, there can be financial pressure, and the expectations need to be negotiated, but they function without financial markets really directly putting pressure on them. The big question is, how much better are these companies than the ones that are driven by financial markets? And I haven't seen any systematic studies of this. Maybe I haven't looked properly, but I guess it's just one factor among many that distinguishes different corporations. As far as I know, the big examples that I know of, like Bosch in Germany, for example, they haven't had major scandals, but they weren't like the super duper model companies either. And they were, for example, involved in the diesel scandal to some extent. So I think it's one dimension of corporate governance, whether or not this financial market pressure is there, but we cannot expect that if this one falls away, everything else will change. And in any case, I mean, I guess in this room here, I don't need to go on long about this. There is a real question about how the voice of employees can then be part of these deliberations. And then again, you get into quite interesting questions about how it's actually possible to have real deliberation between groups whose interests are to some extent opposed. I mean, even if it's just a foundation that owns a company, they might still want to get some benefits for the purposes for what they do with the they usually then have some other purposes of the foundation, like sometimes even giving money to researchers, and for that they want some profits. So you do get these interesting questions about power relations and how can you make sure that it's a real dialogue and not just pure opposition that doesn't get people to really find compromises and so on. And I guess, again, thinking about the German and Danish model, the fact that people have pretty well secured jobs is really important here, because if people can lose their jobs very easily, then this imbalance between what is still in the end the capital side and the labor side just gets too huge. And then, of course, you get to big questions about how labor contracts are organized and so on, but I won't go into this. But in any case, what one needs, if one thinks about such alternative accountability systems that are more in a deliberative mode and that avoid Campbell's law problems, then one has to address this question, how the bundles of rights and responsibilities between employees and the side of finance are to be balanced between each other so that it's internally fair, but also, and that was the third question that you gave us, such that you avoid dysfunctional incentives that would drive companies to violate social standards, environmental standards, human rights standards. And I'm not enough of an empirical researcher to really be able to give you like best practice examples of these kinds of companies and the kinds of accountability mechanisms that they have. But I would say that from a theoretical perspective, that's the area where I would want to look in order to find alternatives to corporations being driven by financial markets and yet having some kind of the possibility of real dialogue and also of telling some companies the hard truth that some things don't work out. I think those are the models that might be a better future. So I'll stop here and I look forward to the other inputs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. I think that really helps to get our discussion started. Before we continue, I forgot to mention we're recording this session and we want to put it online so that the whole world can profit from looking at it afterwards, unless anyone disagrees. So if you disagree with being taped online, please let us know afterwards and then we'll not put the video online. Jerry, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you for that, Lisa. That was great fun and a lovely lead into to what I'm going to be talking about here today. So I see that Lisa is much better behaved than I am. She actually managed to address the 3 questions that we were asked. And because I'm badly behaved, I'm going to end up obliquely getting at some of them. But I did want to take up sort of the one of the themes that Lisa was asking, which is, well, will you get better behavior from firms if they're owned by foundations or some other system? And I posted a set of links in the chat, and the first one asks the musical question: is there something about the institutional terroir of American capitalism that produces monsters? Because in sort of reviewing this, when I think about what are all the worst corporate behaviors that I could think of, almost inevitably, it's American. I think Nestle is pretty bad. So there's definitely some ill-behaved corporations elsewhere, but it's pretty hard to compete with Martin Shkreli. It's pretty hard to compete with the Sacklers and the opioids. It's pretty hard to compete with Exxon. So my opening slide here: shareholder capitalism rules everything around me. Dashri. And the theme is really about what is it about the American system that produces these kinds of behaviors. I wanted to quickly run through a set of surprising, to me, facts about the American capital markets and what's happened, particularly in the last 10 years or so. So you're going to learn, I think, some new things today about the American capital markets that we might be able to jump off from. And I apologize for being so US-centric, but the US really is a distinctive institutional terroir, and so it's kind of worth dwelling on a bit. Also, I'm too lazy to look anywhere else. But so one opening surprising fact is that the number of listed corporations in the US has dropped by half since 1997. And it's not just the dot-com bust, it's not just 2008. There's a lot fewer public corporations in the US today than there used to be. That seems surprising. My last book, The Vanishing American Corporation, was trying to unpack this fact. A second thing is that the IPO market has not really come back. There's sort of a lot of noise out there about recent IPOs with Uber and Airbnb and Coinbase and so on. But if you count them up, we are not close to what it was like in the 1990s. We're not even caught up to what it was like in the 1980s. So in some sense, it is feeling like public corporations are an increasingly obsolete way to organize economic activity. So we should worry about public corporations, but they're not the only way to do business these days. Even in the US, they seem to be disappearing, and that seems surprising to me. The third thing that you may be familiar with, but that is kind of unprecedented in the US, is that corporate ownership is increasingly concentrated in 3 giant index funds. So BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. This is showing the average ownership of firms in the S&P 500, 400, and 600, and then other. And this stops around 2017, but if you go to today, it's probably about 25%. So these 3 funds alone own 1/4 of the average firm in the S&P 500. That's never happened before in all of American history or anywhere else that I can think of. One of the implications of this is that oftentimes a single fund, in particular Vanguard, is the largest shareholder of every company in an industry. So Vanguard is the largest shareholder of Apple and Microsoft, whom you've heard of, AT&T and Verizon, which are the 2 biggest phone companies in the US, JP Morgan Chase and Citigroup, which are the 2 biggest banks, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Phillips, Marathon, which are 4 of the biggest oil companies, UPS and FedEx, which are the 2 biggest delivery companies, Boeing, GE, IBM, Procter & Gamble. This is kind of shocking that one firm is the largest shareholder of all of these different corporations in the US, and hundreds of others, literally hundreds and hundreds of firms. Vanguard is their largest shareholder. Don't worry, I'm sure this has no antitrust implications. Surely nothing could go wrong with all having the same owner in common, even though they're competing in the same industry. I'm sure it's fine and nothing bad will come of this. But it is kind of unprecedented that we have these new entities out there that are such giant owners, and the numbers keep going up. The fourth fact I wanted to share is that when we say the stock market these days, we really mean tech firms. So tech firms make up a ludicrous proportion of market cap. And this is a relatively recent phenomenon, but in the last couple of years, it's really spiked. So Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, and Google now comprise 26% of the market cap of the S&P 500. 5 firms make up 1/4 of the value of the S&P 500. That's also unprecedented. We've never seen a moment where so much of the market is concentrated, and they're all tech firms. As you see on the left, tech makes up all of the market cap these days. So that's kind of without precedent. Another weird thing about tech firms is that they love giving the founders absolute voting control. So this is an article that I published, and I linked this in the chat, about Ayn Rand and corporate governance, that tech VCs keep giving tech firm founders crazy voting rights that give them absolute control over the operations of the corporation. So you probably know that Sergey and Larry at Google control an absolute majority of the votes. Mark Zuckerberg personally controls 58% of the votes at Facebook. He selects the board of directors. He has complete strategic control. And this is true broadly across the tech sector. Nearly half of recent IPOs have been giving the founders absolute voting control. That's kind of weird. That's like a Lee Kuan Yew kind of thing going on in the tech sector. Sixth crazy fact is that corporate governance standards for index firms are really a straitjacket. If you're in the S&P 500, you've got very rigid guidelines on how you have to look. And so these bars, it's a little bit cryptic here, but look at the blue one there. That's the S&P 500, the proportion of firms that have a classified board, meaning 1/3 of the directors are elected each year. That's supposed to enhance stability, make the firm less subject to hostile takeovers. What's happened is that firms in the S&P 500 have completely abandoned this practice. The rest of the world keeps doing it, but S&P 500 firms are targeted if they attempt to have this kind of structure. So if you're in the S&P 500, you're subject to lots of activism and very rigid guidelines on how the firm is operated. Now, for many of them, one of their biggest shareholders loves to say nice things. This is Larry Fink. Every year he writes a letter to CEOs saying, behave yourselves. This year, his nice behave yourself letter to CEOs said, we're asking companies to disclose, a little tiny to read there. We're asking companies to disclose a plan for how their business model will be compatible with a net zero economy. We are asking you to disclose how this plan is incorporated into your long-term strategy and reviewed by your board of directors. So super interesting. Larry Fink is trying to get companies to take the long-term into account because they are an eternal shareholder. BlackRock owns everybody and they own them forever. They never sell. And so in principle, they should be taking the eternal long-term into account. If climate change is bad for the economy, they are the ones that should be able to sort of encourage firms to take that seriously. And yet, in spite of firms being owned by these giant index funds that last forever, nonetheless, hedge funds will target firms that behave themselves. If you deviate from shareholder value maximization, you're very likely to be targeted by hedge funds that will come around and rough you up and propose plans like spinning things off. If you are a socially responsible firm, you're putting a target on your back, like the CEO of Danone saying, come and get me. So I want to summarize all these 7 interesting facts for you. The American stock market increasingly is just the S&P 500. When I lived in London, there was a comedian that said, I live in a suburb of London called England, which I thought was hilarious because it's true. It really is London and other, that's true of the stock market. There's the S&P 500 and everybody else. The S&P 500 now is really just big tech and other. Neither concentrated ownership nor dual class shareholdings mitigate a corporate focus on share price above all else. Even though Zuckerberg could ignore Wall Street, he doesn't. Even though Google could ignore Wall Street, they do not. I think part of the reason for this is if you attract employees with share options, you have to make good on that. If people come to work for you at Google or Facebook because they expect to cash in their shares, then you are bound to do what the stock market wants, even if technically you'll never be taken over. So where does that leave us? I'm going to say something that will not be controversial with you, but might be controversial in the US, which is I think profit-oriented corporations are responsible for almost every major social pathology in the West, certainly in the United States. Purdue Pharmaceutical and the opioid epidemic. It's an astonishing fact that life expectancy declined in the US in the years leading up to the COVID epidemic because of opioids. During the epidemic, 90,000 people have died from drug overdoses, overwhelmingly opioids. This was caused by Purdue Pharmaceutical and a handful of other pharma companies pushing opioids. Big sugar and the obesity epidemic. 40% of Americans are obese. That is a body mass index of over 30. 60% are at least overweight. I am laying this at the feet of big sugar, big processed food. There are corporations in America that are beloved brands whose business model is to sell you sugary caffeinated bubble water in single-use plastic containers that will be with us on the planet forever. And their main function seems to be to create obesity and diabetes. If that's your business model, it's pretty hard to see how adding a purpose is going to help very much. Juul and the return of nicotine addiction. Astoundingly enough, so here I am spending the year at Stanford enjoying the sun and fun. Two Stanford students invented an electronic cigarette because they wanted to help grown-ups stop smoking. They said, you know, the craving for cigarette, they were both smokers, and they said, we're going to come up with a way for people to address their nicotine cravings, and then created the product that evolved into Juul. Once it gets into the hands of venture capitalists, of course, Juul ends up selling bubblegum flavored, candy flavored nicotine pods, literally on websites oriented towards children like Nick Jr. and Cartoon Network. No matter what your noble intentions going in, once you get into sort of a shareholder capitalist system, you're going to end up misbehaving yourself. Big tech and the collapse of happiness, truth, and democracy. I think that one kind of explains itself. We've all been around for the last few years to watch big tech getting people to compulsively watch their phones. If you have children with access to electronic devices, you know the nightmare of them on their iPad or their phone all day, every day, getting anxious and depressed. Big oil and the collapse of human civilization. I think that one's straightforward as well. I'm going to extend the big oil critique here to say, to the extent that economic activities yield atmospheric carbon dioxide that isn't priced, that is, to the extent that whatever you do relies on the use of energy, then species extinction is an unfortunate but inevitable externality of shareholder capitalism. That is, whatever your business is, if it uses energy that produces carbon dioxide that isn't priced, then there is no innocent business. If you're producing carbon dioxide, you are contributing to something bad, no matter how noble your purpose is. That's pretty dark. That leaves us all in kind of a dark place. But it says, even if you're neutral, even if you're not producing big sugar or what have you, there's sort of a cost to that. So a little bit of a dark claim. And what I want to say is, I don't think that there is any escape for this as long as firms operate in a shareholder capitalist system. Listed corporations inevitably put share price first because so many of the mechanisms of corporate governance, at least in the US system, orient firms towards share price above all else. Not shareholders, just to be really clear. It's not shareholders that matter. It's share price. And Lisa's paper that she circulated, I think, had some nice points about this. Price is the thing that matters, not the people behind it. So creating shareholder value in practice means increasing share price. And so my finance friends like Martin Schmaltz will say, no, shareholder value isn't share price. It's this unobservable construct that represents the discounted cash flows of all of the projects that the firm is engaged in. Any executive or student knows that it means share price. And the US has evolved a matrix of institutions that force corporations to focus monomaniacally on share price above all else. Equity analysts will yell at them if they're not making their numbers properly. Hedge funds will target them if they're not making their numbers properly. state corporate laws are optimized for creating shareholder value. Boards of directors almost inevitably seem to believe that they're legally required to create shareholder value and that they are basically slaves of share price, even though we all know that that's not true. Compensation systems, as John talked about in the paper that he circulated, this is the most powerful way to get people to seek shareholder value or to focus on share price is to make sure that almost 100% of their net worth is dependent on their company's share price. And we very much implemented that system since the 1980s. The market for corporate control, if you don't create shareholder value, someone will engage in a tender offer. And the last thing is that investors hate companies that create jobs. They hate companies that pay well. They hate companies that engage in corporate social responsibility. Any do-gooding that corporations do paints a target on their back. And that's, I don't see any easy way around that. I could be wrong, but empirically, I'm pretty sure I'm right about this. So that is my dark claim there. I'm sorry, it was a very sort of US-centric orientation here, but anyway, and John can correct, I think, all of my misperceptions in his discussion. Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Jerry, for that enlightening but also darkening talk. John, can you please continue the discussion?
Yes. So now that we're digging ourselves into a hole of darkness, I'll continue. It doesn't get any better. Hang on 1 second. Let me get this. There we go. Okay, you see the screen? Great. Well, I really, in general, agree with the comments of both my presenters. And just let me start by saying thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor to join you today, notwithstanding the ungodly early hour in California. But I'm getting used to this whole, Zoom suspension of time. Now, let me start with a secondhand personal story that may shed some light on this. Some of you may know that I'm not only a political scientist, I'm also a recovering lawyer. And one of my law school roommates went off to work in a very prestigious corporate law firm, which will remain anonymous to protect the guilty. And as a very young associate, was going into a boardroom with a very senior partner to advise the board on some issue. This senior partner was a pillar of the bar, a Nuremberg prosecutor, no less, very old at this time. Before they walk in, he turns to my friend and says, "Remember this, when you go into a room like this, make sure when you come out, the CEO has as much money as possible. Follow this single rule and you'll do fine." My friend is now a senior partner in that law firm and has done very, very well for himself. Normative implications aside. Now, this gives us some, leverage and insight into what's going on here. That the notion of shareholder primacy, shareholder capitalism, shareholder maximization is actually a set of labels for a much more contentious, conflictual, and complicated unfolding historical process. And it continues to be riddled with tensions and contradictions, so much so that by the time we reach the end of this, hopefully I'll convince you that it's actually self-destructive at a structural level. I will, I guess, also being badly behaved, depart somewhat from the questions posed. In the first instance, because capital markets don't drive people to do anything. The corporate governance system, which is constructed of a number of different bodies of law and regulation and institutions, enable certain privileged actors to pursue their interests as they conceive them. Jerry has laid out how the shift to shareholders primacy and shareholder maximization actually benefits a set of non-shareholder actors as well. This is absolutely central. So we need to look at these systems as systems and look at how they allocate power. And it's the power relations that really do drive these outcomes. And one of the things we see is the corporate governance system, as it is evolved over the past several decades, has favored financial interests, but it has also mediated the inevitable tensions, which economists conceive as agency relationships and agency costs, so that we actually have a new balance of power between financial interest and managerial interests. Of course, what is lost in that new balance of power is a whole set of other social actors, groups, and interests. The kind of interests that are valorized and vindicated by bona fide stakeholder type governance systems and political systems, more broadly speaking, that are less captured by financial and corporate elites. Second, I think we have to be realistic when we look at corporate governance in its specific instantiations and in general about what it can do. This was very common in the 1990s, that a lot of corporate governance theorists thought that the governance system could really take on the work of the regulatory state, as if the governance and self-governance of the corporation would take care of these mammoth negative externality problems and other market failures. And corporate governance isn't particularly good at corporate governance, let alone taking on the responsibilities of the regulatory state, which remains absolutely indispensable. I don't want to rely on boards of directors in any country for the fate of humanity going forward with respect to global warming and other existential issues. So I have a much more confined view of what you can realistically expect from the corporate governance system. Now, I too primarily look at corporate governance for purposes of this talk through an American lens, or more broadly an Anglo-American lens, because this notion of shareholder primacy and shareholder capitalism is so much a part of the neoliberalism that has been so influential in reshaping global economic affairs in the last several decades. So I'm not doing this simply for reasons of fetishizing American exceptionalism. I'm actually looking at it because the United States in particular is so influential in international affairs, and reshaping international economic relationships, that this is spilled over into other systems, though this is absolutely critical. No other country comes close to the United States in manifesting this kind of shareholder view of the corporation, its governance, or shareholder and finance-centric way of organizing the economy. Even the British don't really come close to this for a variety of political reasons. Even if the financial sector as a portion of the British economy is even larger than the United States. Now, shareholder primacy is both an ideological conception, performing ideological functions and work, and a kind of label for a set of legal structural features of contemporary capitalism. And I think you have to deal with them and deal with shareholder primacy and shareholder capitalism at both levels. And this emerges initially as an intellectual theoretical matter out of the 1970s from the Chicago School of Law and Economics and their fellow travelers. But it really emerges as a substantial economic force in the 1980s with the rise of hostile takeovers. Now, that's a set of institutional changes, both in the financial markets and in law. There are certain doctrines that are adopted that facilitate and make corporations and their managements vulnerable to takeover. Those are enabled and valorized, and are really, it's a forcing of the issue through the court that was made possible by a set of developments within the financial markets and financial institutions, most famously associated with the Drexel Lambert Investment Bank and Michael Milken. But this rapidly spreads throughout the American and British financial sector to fuel this kind of activity. Now, of course, managers and directors don't like hostile takeovers. That means they lose their jobs. So, of course, we have an obvious conflict of interest between shareholders, who presumably will be benefited by the takeover premiums, and the incumbent managers. And if you look back at the legal developments and political developments surrounding corporate governance in the 1980s into the early 1990s, it's really a set of titanic battles between these two extremely powerful interests. But we should keep in mind, those interests overlap. It's not some mom and pop shareholder that's driving this system. It is institutional investors and investment banks. This ties into what Jerry was saying with this immense concentration of capital. We're at the end stage of that. I'm tracing it back to its origins. And what this implicates is that we have, in effect, a battle between two very powerful groups, but the groups themselves overlap. If it's institutional investors, particularly those excluding public employee pension funds and including investment banks, we're talking about corporations raiding other corporations. And the people who run large financial institutions as managers have the same kind of interest in security and autonomy in decision-making as their targets. And they have the same interest in becoming exceedingly wealthy. So you end up with a dynamic that the development of the neoliberal corporate governance system both generates this tendency towards maximizing shareholder value, but at the same time, also maximizing the short-term compensation of senior corporate managers and directors. This really, in a much broader sense, was enabled by a set of very large-scale changes in the Western economies, particularly that of the United States. For a whole host of reasons we can't get into in this forum, finance begins to globalize, and many of the restrictions on finance that enabled the post-war kind of Keynesian economic models to thrive falls apart with the collapse of Bretton Woods. All of a sudden, you have a new financial monetary structure in the world that opens up finance globally. And Econ 101 tells us that the most mobile factor of production is empowered by that mobility. That sets off a cascading set of changes throughout the developed political economies that we're still living with and living through. The second big change is the decline of organized labor, particularly in the United States, and working class politics more generally. And that is certainly not restricted to the United States. And really, when you look at it, the development of finance capitalism over the past 30 or 40 years, the decline of labor is absolutely critical. With the decline of labor, these political economic systems lose the relations of countervailing power that counterbalance both finance and corporate management. Once labor is effectively sidelined, the parties that once championed labor's interests fundamentally transform into these third way kind of center left liberal parties. You have a completely different power dynamic and developmental game, which is dominated by managers and financiers. And in that transformation, shareholder primacy and the shareholder conception of the corporation becomes increasingly important and useful, both as a way of guiding and framing distributional conflicts in which managers and financial elites are increasingly the winners. They compete against each other. Labor and the middle class are clearly the losers. And as an ideological appeal, purporting to explain how the world works. And allegedly kind of hard-headed, practical, if not cynical ways. Let's not be naive, utopian idealists. Get real. The world's a tough, competitive place, and this is how you keep score, to paraphrase Michael Milken's description of shareholder value. So the old post-war distributional conflict was dominated by labor versus management. By the end of the 1980s, you get a new distributional conflict that's dominated by the conflict between managers and shareholders and their allied financial institutions. And let's keep in mind that the mass of shareholders do not have identical interest to these financial institutions that actually mediate and orchestrate shareholder primacy and shareholder corporate governance, because those financial institutions tend to structure deals and transactions in ways that benefit them disproportionately in all sorts of ways. And this also is kind of the pointy end of the spearhead for the financialization of the economy, more broadly speaking, where it's not merely a matter now that we think of the corporation in terms of shareholder maximization. We start to think more and more in financialized terms about all power relations, all economic relations. And we start falling into the world that Lisa describes of not only managing by numbers, but increasingly living by numbers that don't capture the normative realities or the normative imperatives of a stable, secure, sustainable social, economic, and political order. Financialization also responds to a set of underlying problems in corporations themselves and the corporate economy itself, particularly after the early 1970s, when you start to see a slowdown in growth and productivity. That when we have those kinds of slowdowns, corporate profits start to split. It's one of the reasons why we see the kind of hypertrophy of tech firms as a component of the capital markets capitalization. That's where the profits are, or the anticipated profits are in many cases, since they will forego profits in order to further monopolization. In the vast majority of other firms, profits have become a long-standing problem, often resolved through financialization and financial engineering. So we have the illusion of profitability and increasing profitability, which also fuels further financialization and shareholder returns. I'll explain this in a little more detail momentarily. And in this evolving political economy, it's labor and more broadly the middle class that are the big losers. And if we look at this simple graph, you can see how union density, and this is the kind of relationship that's certainly not unique to the United States. In this way, the United States is not exceptional. It's just one more example. Unions have an egalitarian effect on the distribution of income. As they decline in power, and power is generally, but not exclusively measured in union density, you start to see upward redistribution of wealth, not surprisingly. And this, of course, goes far beyond the corporate governance system itself to all the other ancillary activities of the state that can promote more egalitarian distributional outcomes. So here we have a very interesting relationship where we see the labor share of income steadily going down from the peak of union density in the 1950s in the United States and the rise in pre-tax corporate profits. So this is a very clear distributional battle that labor is steadily losing. To smooth out that relationship, you can see this downward slope in labor share of corporate income in particular. Which means in that context, it's finance and managers dividing the spoils in this kind of new system. As I mentioned, managers are vulnerable to ouster in a world where takeovers, proxy fights, activist investors are possible and empowered. Their response to this, or one of the responses to this, is, well, if you cannot simply stop this threat to your professional tenures, one compensatory way of dealing with the problem is get paid a lot more. Now, of course, this sets up a conflict with the various shareholder or pro-shareholder forces that are driving this set of developments, except that in many cases, that overlap between managers in the financial sector and managers in the non-financial sector starts to come to the fore, so that corporate governance rules develop to allow all sorts of side payments. Now, here's where the United States becomes quite distinctive, along with the UK. These kinds of side payments are very common in liberal market economies. In many other economies, they are simply impossible as a consequence of power relations and, in many cases, of formal law. So, for example, when Mannesmann was taken over by Vodafone in Germany, one of the ways of facilitating that deal in the end was a set of side payments to Mannesmann's board members. They were criminally prosecuted by the German prosecutors in Dusseldorf for breach of fiduciary duty. This is anathema and absolutely shocking to American British sensibilities. It is not to continental sensibilities, certainly Central European sensibilities, in which labor remains much more powerful as an institutional actor. But this does underscore this dynamic that we're talking about a distributional battle between new actors, newly empowered, and it becomes really a system of looting, of wealth extraction. And here is an indication of how closely the objective of a shareholder-driven form of capitalism is with soaring managerial compensation. You can see how CEO compensation becomes essentially paralleled and tethered to the performance of stock prices.
John,
Yeah.
this is fascinating material, but we also need to move it towards the discussion in a moment.
Yes, I'm just about to end. So the upshot of this is that shareholder capitalism is self-perpetuating because of these conflictual dynamics between shareholders, financiers on the one hand, and managers on the other. But it's also self-subverting. So stock options are rationalized as aligning managerial and shareholder interests. They, in fact, become the most efficient and effective way ever devised to loot corporations. Shareholder primacy is touted as forcing and compelling corporate efficiency, yet it effectively erodes research and development, furthers deindustrialization, and worsens all sorts of economic criteria for the functioning of firms in a practical sense. And financialization that has been facilitated by shareholder capitalism ultimately creates a set of incentives for short-termism and pro-finance governmental and regulatory policies that ultimately created the conditions for the global financial crisis and ultimately results in the world we're now living in which markets and therefore their returns are artificially propped up by central bank monetary policy. So we really don't have, free neoliberal markets. What we now have are financialized hothouses for privileged categories of economic actors, and the rest of us have to live in the world that they created. That finally, I'll end on this point, the belated embrace of stakeholder capitalism by many corporate elites, including the Business Roundtable in the United States, is really an old maneuver that we have seen for decades. And what it essentially does is it weaponizes the too many masters problems that if corporations and their managers are able to pursue the interest of this wide array of stakeholders, they can always justify any action they want to take. It's a wonderful way of reducing accountability by claiming accountability in myriad ways. So that's just one of my pet peeves that I wanted to alert people to. So we are still very much mired in this financialized world, though it's taken increasingly pathological forms economically, and there's a legitimacy crisis that it's generated because the shareholder and financial ideology is increasingly zombified. It's regularly and ritually referred to without true believers anymore. And that has helped to poison our politics and render our economies dysfunctional. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Yeah, this, now we end on zombies. That's even darker. Lots of questions, I guess. I see some hands. I need to switch back myself to gallery mode to get a better overview of where the questions are. Tali and Kasim are first. Tali, you want to start?
Sure. Can you hear me? Great. Thank you, all of you, for those wonderful talks. I have two questions. The first is for Lisa, and the second is a more general question. So Lisa talks about how financialization as a kind of governance regime gives rise to all manner of perverse incentives. Of course, perverse incentives can emerge or can arise as like an unintended result or consequence of any kind of governance structure, right? And sometimes hyperquantification can correct against other mistakes in organized decision-making. I think any fan of the film Moneyball and the Bill James approach to sort of a metrical assessment of baseball team management will realize that. So my question for Lisa is why are these particular perverse incentives worse on a standard of evaluation that financial asset owners would also have reason to endorse? And I think this question is maybe connected to the second one, which is a more general question about whether, I mean, so one of the things that I'm caused to consider here is whether is what the modifier financial capitalism or shareholder capitalism is really doing in this discussion. So whether the pathologies that are really being presented are intrinsic to financial capitalism or just capitalism as such on any kind of robust definition of what it would be, right? So I mean, many people would argue that just, you know, these are intrinsic to any kind of capitalism that, you know, could pass muster definitionally. And so maybe the speakers could address this question of how like a social welfare standard for the management of privately owned assets is compatible with the basic structure of a capitalist order predicated on the assertion or the belief that private decision rights over capital assets is itself both a matter of fundamental entitlement, and when you facilitate it, it conduces to general prosperity. And maybe a connected question to that would be, you know, this, maybe if you could also not, you know, speak to this concern about giving corporations, you know, making corporations too socially responsible is also sometimes criticized as an extension of private powers over public goods that private actors and decision makers shouldn't have. So sometimes the argument is made that greater social responsibility is actually just you know, putting more and more of our life, common life, under the control of private actors, and that we have reasons of right to avoid that. So if people could speak to those last two as well, as Lisa to the first one.
Okay, there's a host of questions. Let's try to keep it short to have as many people join in the discussion. So I think all three of the speakers want to speak to this. So maybe let's take them in the order that we have been starting with. Lisa?
I'm not sure it's always worse. I mean, feudalism was not nice either. And governments by networks isn't nice either. And I guess two kinds of factors have an impact here. One is sort of the overall strength of ideology and the existence of counterpowers. And that was, in that respect, it was just such an all-encompassing idea financial markets are these mirrors of reality and they know better than individuals, and all these things coming together just created very few opportunities of resistance for other groups, stakeholders, labor, of course, in society. So I think that was probably more important than the fact that these dysfunctional incentives were so much worse than the power relations. The other is, and I mean, maybe others are in a better position to talk about this, but I think there's always sort of a temporal index to these power relations and the strength of different ideologies. And I think after 89, there was just a sense of, this is the end of history. This is the best of all possible worlds. So what do you want? And I think that also contributed a lot and led to these massive distortions. And then, I mean, the other questions are really big ones. So I'll only say a few things briefly and then hand over to the others. I guess it depends a bit on what you mean by capitalism. I think there can be really strong counterpowers that can keep private ownership under better control than we see at the moment, at least. If you have very strong unions, if it's clear that property is a publicly legally created item that can also be changed, if governments made more frequent use of just dispossessing corporations if they misbehave or taking away their license, I think you could have quite a few mechanisms that are not being used at the moment, also because of the public perception of these things, which would at least change these things. On your last point of, should we even ask corporations to do these kinds of things? In the best of all possible worlds, probably no. But if you start from where we are, if corporations don't do some of these things, we are completely lost. So I think at the moment, from a sort of non-ideal perspective, we need to ask these questions of how we can get corporations, these strange kinds of animals that would probably not exist in a better world, to take care of certain environmental issues and social issues. And then maybe you can also think about how we can dismantle them over time, but we are not in a position just to say, oh, let's just not care about what they do. Let's just do this on a private, sort of individual, sort of civil society private basis, as not private property basis, or let the state do it. And one last note on this, there is a bit of a danger that I sometimes see of sort of the opposite way, which works relatively well in Europe, maybe, to say, well, let the state do all these things. If you talk to people from countries where the state is also very corrupt, then it really becomes a trading in second or third or fourth best solutions. And then again, I don't think we can we don't have the luxury of saying, let's not give any of these responsibilities to corporations. I'll stop here.
Great. Yeah, no, thank you so much for that question, Tully. That's great fun. I have been increasingly convinced by John's colleagues in political science by the notions of varieties of capitalism. And I don't love the version that has Germany and the US and everyone else fits uneasily in the middle. I think the right way to think about varieties of capitalism is that there's a configuration of institutions that create a kind of institutional terroir that breeds certain kinds of firms, and that shareholder capitalism breeds a particular kind of firm that you don't see elsewhere. There's stuff that happens in the US that would never happen in a civilized country. The organization of the labor markets. Just one way to look at this, and I pasted this paper into the chat, so I think it's actually not a terrible paper. It's kind of fun. It's called Varieties of Uberization, looking at how do you take the basic technology of matching riders and drivers using GPS-enabled smartphones. Like, that's entirely the business of ride hailing. It looks radically different around the world because the technology gets incubated differently depending on the configuration of institutions that you've got. And so in the US, it looks like Uber, which wants drivers to be classified as contractors so that minimum wage doesn't apply. Does not look like that in Germany. It doesn't fly at all in France. It looks very different in Sweden, Nigeria, Indonesia. In the paper, we go through this broadly. So I think that basically the kind of corporations you get reflects the institutional configuration that you're in. So that would be sort of one point. And the second would be, and I'm working on a book on this, so it's much on my mind these days, is that I think we're going through a pretty significant reconfiguration of that set of institutions driven by information and communication technologies. So it's going to sound a little bit psychedelic, but financialization is basically ICTs come to the capital markets. Uberization is ICTs, information and communication technologies, come to the labor markets. Nikification is ICTs come to supply markets. Amazon is ICTs come to distribution or product markets. And so what we're seeing is technology shifting all of the core factor markets of the corporation into a new way of operating. And so in some sense, finance, this is going to sound heretical with this group, but finance is not interesting anymore. 10 years ago, we used to think that Goldman Sachs was a vampire squid that was dominating the world, and they sort of bestrode the earth as this powerful institution. Goldman Sachs is hemorrhaging employees because people don't want to work there anymore because investment banking is increasingly irrelevant. Now they want to go to work for Coinbase and make twice as much money trading in cryptocurrencies. Coinbase's IPO valued them at nearly the same as Goldman Sachs, for God's sake. So I think we're moving into we're moving past finance capitalism into something that looks really different as these core institutions get reconfigured. I realize that's a bit more psychedelic than you were asking about, but that's, I think the interesting question now is how do we rein in this mess to create human corporations? Rather than fighting the last battles, let's think about how do we configure these institutions to generate humane looking economic enterprises rather than the ones that we got. So.
John, you're
Sorry about that. It's interesting, Jerry moved into big tech because one of my current projects with John Zeisman at Berkeley and Morton Kenny at Davis is on the re-regulation of big tech and its relationship to antitrust and other regulatory domains. But one of the foundations of this kind of emerging big tech economy is a political alliance between finance and big tech, in part because it helps fuel their monopolization efforts, and it is politically instrumental. So to that extent, the past isn't dead, it's not even past. It's still very much with us. Plus, much of the Western economy is being propped up by a set of financially driven policies that are engineered, and very deliberately so, to prop up asset prices. This is in the interest of finance, it's in the interest of big tech. And we are largely held hostage to it. And this is a matter of state capture, as is Uberization. Uberization is really a regulatory arbitrage play. But regulatory arbitrage only works when state authorities allow regulatory arbitrage to succeed. And in many places in Europe, that has been thwarted very, very quickly. You just simply cannot reclassify people legally so easily as you can in, say, the United States. But that's a political question, not an economic or even an essentially legal question. It's an output of the system. And to go back to the initial question, I agree with a lot of what Lisa had to say about the nature of financialization, what it does to the corporation, and I think she really has it right. And you can use corporations and corporate governance for more socially beneficial ends. But to do that, you have to take power relations and their institutional foundation seriously. And you have to actually empower within legally prescribed governance structures, different stakeholder groups so that they actually participate in decision-making. Otherwise, it's a charade, ideologically and structurally, and it's captured by design.
Okay, Kasim, next question is from you.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you to the three panelists for the presentation and the discussion. It's really interesting. My background is as a political theorist philosopher, so apologies if this isn't my sort of main field of expertise. I had, I think, a comment or two for Professor Herzog and then a comment or two for Professor Davis. I mean, Professor Cioffi, it was most like a historical descriptive, so I think I was largely followed and on board with that. So Professor Herzog, you mentioned about, quite focused on Goodhart's and Campbell's law, right? The sort of quantification fallacy that if you focus on the metrics, then you miss what they're supposed to be tracking. I mean, thinking about this, I mean, as well as being a PhD student, I'm also a governor of a school in England here. And I guess I'm also a recovering corporate lawyer as well. And it strikes me that this sort of fallacy is a sort of a general one of organizations as a whole, right? Which any organization which tries to use metrics to measure internal performance will face these sorts of fallacies. So if I think from my school context, obsessive focus on, what can be quantified in terms of exam results or attendance figures may mask certain other issues, which as a board member, we have to be quite aware and alive to. So if I think about, but it strikes me that this sort of, and you mentioned that the different agents or different sort of subgroups within a corporation or firm will have sort of perverse incentives. But I'm somewhat heartened by the fact that corporations themselves have good incentives, or at least the management have good incentives to try and avoid this, right? So I think maybe Wells Fargo might be a good example of this, right? So they want people to have new customers. So the incentives for the subunits is just to fake customers. And make them up, and it turns out this is bad for the organization as a whole when it comes to light. So when you said there needs to be discussion as opposed to numbers, and we've had a few mentions here of the role of corporate governance boards, and as a role as a governor in a much smaller context, it seems to be that that financial organizations or just firms in general are incentivized, or the governance is they are incentivized, or should be incentivized, to try and crack down on sort of an over-reliance on figures without understanding the sort of the realities which sit underneath them. You also mentioned about sort of accountability mechanisms. One which occurs to me as an increasing trend, and I think there's a number of trendy papers in business journals on this, is what was proposed by Matt Levine from Bloomberg is everything securities fraud. I don't know if anyone else has been following this trend, which is essentially of shareholders litigating whenever the company does anything wrong. And I'm used wrong in the most general moral sense. So if, for example, there's a sexual harassment scandal by a board member or CEO, you might think the wronged party is the victim of sexual harassment, and they probably are. But shareholders will litigate on this basis because they'll say, well, the company promised that they were adhering to all sorts of certain standards and moral standards. They didn't. And the share price has now gone down. We, the shareholders, are aggrieved. We're litigating this. And there's a whole range of anything from like non-environment, like breaking environmental standards, fraud, like I said, sexual harassment. Now, there's questions about whether this is a good accountability mechanism, because it's essentially the shareholders suing the company. And there's some interesting analysis about to what extent they're parasitical or they run parallel to regulatory investigations, which may also be brought into play here, right? You have criminal investigations of sexual harassment. That is another developing accountability mechanism. I know there was some discussion about whether companies are accountable to the share price or shareholders, and this is an instance in which shareholders are increasingly asserting themselves. So that was two thoughts.
Thank you, Kasim.
Oh, shall I just leave it there then? Maybe I'll save it for email.
Yeah.
Thank
Lisa,
you.
You want to respond first?
Yeah, that's true that Campbell's law is everywhere, but the question is to what extent there are also other mechanisms that can counter it. And if corporations are very much in this managerial mode, then you don't have culture interpersonal contacts and many other counter mechanisms that do play a role in many other institutions. They do also play a role in many corporations, but they are not sort of foreseen mechanisms by management. They more happen to be still there and hopefully do some good work. Are managers incentivized to prevent this? No, they are incentivized to do whatever their own incentives are, and that's not necessary. That can align with preventing other people going for their incentives instead of doing what's right, but it's not necessarily the case, and they need to understand first that there is such a problem. Otherwise, they cannot even address it. So in that sense, I mean, in corporations, usually some kind of dialogical exchange does happen. So people don't only communicate through spreadsheets. But it's simply not true that the sort of middle to upper management is per se incentivized to prevent these things. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes it's sort of pushing down these kind of things because the pressure comes from above, and the manager wants they want their numbers to look good, and so they put the pressure on lower levels. On this legal litigation thing, that is interesting, but I agree with what you said at the end. It tends to be parasitic on other forms of accountability, and you need either whistleblowers or courageous journalists, and then a legal system that is willing to do something about it. And I'm not so sure whether it's sort of a good strategy overall that this now gets to be put into the hands of private shareholders. It adds pressure on the corporations, but that seems to be a kind of privatization of what should be genuinely public power and public legal regulation. Maybe given the very non-ideal situation we are in, it is a counter effect to certain even worse things. But on the whole, here I would say, what we had briefly discussed before, this is a form of privatization of enforcement, if you like, or of the threat of enforcement, which I don't think is healthy. And the most important thing is that it can't function on its own. It's always parasitic. And that's why I'm not, I don't think it can replace anything.
Okay, John or Jerry, do you want to join in?
Yeah, I wanted to address that last point about what really translates into governance, firm governance as regulatory mechanism. There was a very famous case coming out of Delaware about 1990 called In re Caremark, which interpreted fiduciary duties to include good faith efforts to make sure that regulatory requirements were complied with by the board and senior management. This was just a beloved decision by law and economics scholars and other law professors. It was supposedly embodied the absorption of the regulatory state into firm governance, and of course, it does nothing of the sort. The real structure of the practicalities of shareholder litigation and fiduciary duties is that, yes, there are all these fiduciary obligations, and then there's a business judgment rule that essentially pardons all sorts of corporate decision making in a very, very lenient and generous manner, and that is entirely predictable. If fiduciary duties were both expansive and stringently enforced by courts, we would have endless, pervasive, expensive litigation over everything. And courts would be charged with the second guessing of corporate management in a virtually infinite array of practical circumstances. Of course, this is no way to run a business or an economy, and certainly the judges are not on board with this. Having known quite a few judges, one of the things they are concerned with is the metric of their caseloads, and they really don't like to have them infinitely expanding, trust me. So this is the practicalities of the matter, so much so that even in legal jurisdictions like in continental Europe that don't necessarily have the kind of fiduciary law structure of the common law, and codes don't provide for a business judgment rule, the courts have inferred it anyway. which they're really not supposed to do according to the civil law tradition, but it's essential. So this is hoping against hope. But let me add one caveat. This observation that every corporate wrongdoing has a tendency to trigger a shareholder suit is not new. It's been around for decades. In part, it's true, but largely it's a sideshow. These are often strike suits. They are either dismissed very quickly or they're settled for nuisance value and they go away. That's really not that big a deal. The big deal is this dynamic is used as part of the kind of politics of the alleged tort explosion to try to remove mechanisms of legal accountability on powerful actors, including those in the corporation. So that's the real politics of what tends to be going on in these cases.
Okay, Jerry?
Yeah, I'll just throw in one or two quick things, a couple of grenades here. So one is the notion, I think we would all agree that in an ideal world, social welfare is attended to by governments that are democratically accountable, that it's really sort of democratically accountable representatives who should be making core choices and not corporations on our behalf. That sits uneasily with the last 3 months in the United States, where state legislatures, one after another, are trying to limit the votes of their minority populations. And it's giant corporations that are leaping into the fray. It feels strange to be saying that Coca-Cola, whom I might have besmirched a few minutes ago, is demanding that the Georgia legislature protect voting rights, that Dell and American Airlines in Texas are telling the legislature, we're not okay with this. State after state, the largest corporations are banding together to say, voting rights are human rights. This is essential to democracy. Knock this stuff off. All of this is premised on, a big lie about election being stolen, and we're not going to support this. And withdrawing campaign contributions from legislators that are engaging in this. So on the one hand, I wish it weren't up to corporations to vouchsafe democracy. On the other hand, at the moment, I'm kind of grateful for some of these firms doing what they do. So.
Okay, Philip, next question is yours.
Yes, thanks first of all for 3 great presentations. I wanted to ask what I take to be the eminent question, which is, well, if everything's kind of screwed, what do we do? And I think Lisa was there. So I think my question has 3 parts to it. So first, what do we need in reform? And I think, Lisa, you already elaborated on this quite a bit. But then the next 2 questions are, well, how, if we are somewhat clear on what we need in reform, how do we get there? And maybe the most interesting one is, well, is there anyone in the current power structures we can count upon? So is there anybody who's advantaged right now and has, in fact, the say and the power and the means to change something that we could mobilize to somehow to change something in the structures?
Thanks, Philip. The question was also on my mind. Let's maybe start in reverse order this time. So John, and then Jerry, and then back to Lisa.
Yeah, that really is the ultimate question. And perhaps weirdly, maybe I'm a bit more optimistic than the tenor of this discussion has implied. For the very fact that I'm describing a zombie ideology in a profoundly dysfunctional political economic order, one that is, at least in substantial part, been exported by the United States. As I tell my students in political economy classes, the global financial crisis was probably the most successful American export in decades. And we're still not recovered from it politically or economically. It really did start a set of kind of tectonic movements. And what Jerry just described, with this interesting intervention of large corporations and corporate elites into the active subversion of democracy and the rule of law, really starts to indicate that they are nervous. They're nervous about the disintegration of the institutional foundations of their own prosperity and power, even as they contributed so mightily to that very disintegration along the way. We also have a set of social movements that are emerging. It's a chaotic situation, but periods of transition generally are. And the elites are nervous by developments on not only the left, but probably even more importantly on the right. And that really starts to open up space for reforms. And those reforms, as I think each one of us have pointed out in our own ways, require us to pay attention to how power is constituted and allocated. This is an era in which you need to take institutional design very, very seriously in ways that really popular politics hasn't in decades, many decades. So stakeholder notions of governance and the economy are fine, but you actually really do have to attend to those power relationships and cultivate them deliberately. That only comes under fairly extreme duress of the elites, but it can come. The real, difficult part of this is the elites may break in different ways in different places. You're not entitled to Franklin Roosevelt. Sometimes you get a George W. Bush instead. And this is where the reality of political agency comes into play. But you have to know what your aspirations are and what to ask for and demand if you're going to be potentially effective.
John, in an earlier seminar, we also talked about workers versus other stakeholders. So are you mainly thinking of workers and workers' empowerment and voice in corporations, or also of a broader set of stakeholders?
My own thinking is the number of stakeholders incorporated into governance processes should be restricted to actors that have an internal role within the corporation. I think you really do run into the too many masters problem as you expand the number of constituencies that are represented. But workers are the great, if not omission, it's the great exile within the neoliberal order. So I look to the European model, and particularly Germany's co-determination structures within the corporate form as a model to follow. And it's interesting that for the first time in my experience, senior politicians in the United States are actually starting to talk about things like sectoral collective bargaining and co-determination. And that's a function of the response on the left to the global financial crisis of financialization. But I find that to be indispensable as one of the routes moving forward.
Okay. Jerry.
So Philip asked 3 questions. I'll give 3 quick answers to the extent that I can. So what do we need in reform? I think, as I said, ICTs, information and communication technologies, are fundamentally changing markets, making it possible to have markets for things where we didn't have markets before. That applies to finance, capital, labor, supplies, distribution, how firms operate internally. I think that there's a new movement for antitrust as a form of reform, and John mentioned this as well. I don't think antitrust in itself is sufficient. I think that regulating the way that firms compete has some place, but it's not at all the most important place. In California, during the election, Proposition 22 passed, which allows DoorDash, Uber, Lyft to classify drivers as contractors and not employees. this is going to be a disaster for American labor, absolute disaster. And it's going to spread across the states, and you're going to see immiseration on a vast scale. Sorry to be so morose. So we really need to be rethinking the whole regulatory apparatus, how we regulate labor markets, capital markets, distribution or product markets, supply. We need to rethink that whole schmear. In the ideal world, we end up with democracy from above and democracy from below. We've got the technologies that could allow people to be voting on things all day, every day. We could have worker voice just built into the apparatus of the way enterprises operate. And democracy from above is basically electoral democracy overseeing corporations in a way that I think is responsive to the people. So if we're clear on that, how do we get there? Corporations are collapsing on their own. I mean, the fact that we have half as many as 25 years ago in the shareholder system, corporations are largely unsustainable. Tech companies will, big tech companies of particular flavor are survivable, but I don't think that's true very broadly. If you can rent all of the parts of a business, why would you ever go public? You can grow and collapse quickly without ever going public by renting all of the parts. And so I don't think the corporation per se is the institution we're likely to see in the future. But we are at this weird moment where the left and the right agree on the need to come up with a better structure to rein in corporate power. Amy Klobuchar and Josh Hawley both have new books on antitrust, saying corporations are wicked and have too much power. Let's rein them in. This is weird. We are at this moment where the left and the right agree corporations are out of control and we need to rethink things. So it's an interesting time that it's become an issue, across the political spectrum. There's agreement that things have gone wrong and we need to rethink things. So it's at minimum, it's opening up a political dialogue. Who knows where it'll go? And who can we count on in the power structure? I'm going to say Vanguard is underappreciated as a vehicle. So, the big three, two of them are publicly traded corporations. Vanguard, though, is a mutual. It is not a traditional corporation. It's a mutual owned by the people who invest in it. So Vanguard isn't Wall Street. They're in Pennsylvania. The people that work there wear polyester suits and aren't paid that well. I mean, Vanguard really should represent, if you own the whole market and you intend to own it forever, then you should be thinking climate change is bad. That'll be bad for the market. Let's take a long-term perspective. So if we could turn Vanguard to be a bit more of a, the Bernie Sanders mutual fund, that might be one thought. Not sure I'm super optimistic, but they are a mutual. They are not a shareholder-owned corporation. Vanguard really should be an interesting ally in this effort.
Okay, thanks. Let's go back to Europe. And Lisa, originally from Germany.
Well, I'm seeing all the deficits of the German people,
etc.
Yeah, I agree with a lot that has been said. So let me just focus briefly on one other thing. I think on the front of wars of ideology, I think there's one element that is very important, and I'm probably biased because that's what I'm working on at the moment. But I think the one idea that has been extremely powerful to support the pro-market camp was that markets are so great in dealing with information. And what it in fact enabled was that corporations in various areas have become extremely powerful epistemic players. And if public discourse is then distorted because it's the corporations or the scientists paid by them or whatever that determine how things are publicly perceived, then how are you going to get out of that loop? So I think one key element is that we need to sort of have a democratic reclaiming of knowledge production, public discourse. That together with the push for democratizing work, that's I think going to be important. So, and I mean, sometimes I wonder whether we need something like the Mont Pelerin Society on the left. It took them a couple of decades. And I mean, there are a couple of left-wing organizations that claim that they are the left-wing Mont Pelerin Society. I don't know whether this is going to work, but I think there is also a bit of the left sometimes have a lot of infighting about details instead of seeing the big picture where they actually need to stick together. at least in Europe, that's a problem. And I think that's something that we cannot afford given where we are at the moment.
Okay, time for a final question. Who wants to address that final question? No one?
Can I actually ask one to the two other speakers?
Yeah, that's good.
So you mentioned the huge influence of American thought on these things, or lobbyism or whatever, on the world. And one thing that I'm worried about is that institutions like the WTO and international patent law, these kinds of things, I mean, it took a long time for international agreements to come about at all, but unraveling them, changing them is going to be very, very difficult. And I don't know whether you see some kind of hunger in the US and maybe even certain political actors that would actually be willing to do something to also contribute to international reform, because otherwise there's a risk of a huge sort of institutional delay, because these international institutions are all still shaped by the ideologies from 50 years ago. And that's something where I think there's a lot of sort of path dependency, and the things are stuck, and then individual countries cannot do reform because they are stuck in these international treaties and so on. So is that something where you see any kind of discussion or actors in the American landscape?
John, for you, John.
Okay. Well, right now I see, well, first of all, I think you have to distinguish between governance of the international financial system and monetary system from the trade system. The two are, intertwined critically, and we've lost sight on how they're intertwined. The post-war international order was profoundly influenced by Keynes at Bretton Woods. And he said, you can have free trade and expand it, or you can have free movement of capital. You can't have both. And we've been doing our best to prove Keynes right for the last 30 or 40 years. And the problem is, coming up with a new international monetary and financial system is awfully difficult. And unfortunately, it usually follows something catastrophic, like a major global conflict, the decline of a global hegemon. That would be us in this, the US in this case. These are profoundly disruptive and dislocating events. And there's no clear guarantee that what substitutes and replaces the existing order is going to be better. On the trade route, I think the WTO is being systematically defanged and disempowered over the last 10 years or so. And I don't see that reversing. I don't see major powers giving back their sovereignty or pooled sovereignty in the case of the EU to the WTO. We're in for a period of a lot of conflict and a lot of uncertainty in the development of the trade regime, and probably a lot of regional deals and bilateral deals. But that doesn't really affect the underlying foundations of finance capitalism and technological capitalism. In fact, on the tech front, what we're seeing emerge is really a regionalization of economies. Europe, US, North America, India, and China seem to be the major players. And what Jerry described in terms of a big push towards antitrust and re-regulation of tech is occurring in different ways in each of those places. Europe right now is in the lead as a first mover for a variety of reasons. And it's very interesting to watch this play out because it's happening with breathtaking speed. But there's one other thing that—
Would this mean that this sort of idea of shareholder capital, so would this regionalization mean that this idea of shareholder capitalism is also more and more indexed towards the US and not so much towards China or maybe partially the EU?
I don't think shareholder capitalism ever applied very well as a descriptor outside of the Anglo-American economies. Simply for the reasons that Jerry was talking about when he was referring to varieties of capitalism. The configuration and structure of institutions and the allocation of political power in these different countries and regions is so vastly different that in most places it's just not accommodating to American or British style shareholder capitalism. But we have seen increasing financialization of all of these economies. So, you know, there is more attention to shareholder and financial issues in Europe than there used to be, most certainly. It's not as extreme as in the US or the UK, but it has had an effect. And the financialization of the economy in general, it's being propped up essentially by free debt, is pervasive. Yeah, that's certainly a big part of the European problem. And underlying that is what economists call secular stagnation. This is manifest in the propping up of entire economies by free money from central banks. It's also, I think, responsible for some of the trends we've been seeing. And there's another set of facts that apply to both my presentation and Jerry's. Jerry noted how the number of listed corporations is sinking. One factor there is mergers. You know, they buy each other up. Another is that companies are being taken private by private equity. But underlying that is that the securities markets are no longer being used to raise capital. You know, that's why you see this IPO drought. And in that respect, even in the most liberal market financial systems, we're starting to see the role of equity change from raising capital to allocating control rights, which is really much more common around the world. But that's also because companies have access to free debt or near free debt, and they're not really investing in productive activities anymore. So not only do you see the decline in listed companies, you see a massive decline in the number of shares because they're buying back their own shares to manipulate their share prices. This is what I was talking about, the illusion of profitability. And that, you know, that points to some really big underlying economic problems to solve.
Jerry, the last word is yours today.
All right. Well, I guess a counterpoint to some of that would be, I think I don't worry too much about companies not investing for the future or engaging in share buybacks, because I think a lot of the companies that are doing this are pretty much doomed anyway. So I don't think Xerox should really be building any new factories to make copiers. I don't think that IBM should be thinking about their next sort of giant computers. To some extent, capital is not scarce, but capital is not the element that new enterprises need. If you can snap together an enterprise from available parts, then it's not the scarcity of capital that's going to drive, you know, what kind of enterprises you get. And that opens up really interesting possibilities. It's easier to do worker-owned co-ops when you don't need to build your own factory. Anyway, that would take a long bit to unpack, but watch for platform cooperativism. It's an interesting movement, and I think there's some pretty cool ideas out there. And yeah, thanks for hosting this. This has been great fun.
Yes, thank you very much. This has been a fun conversation.
Thanks to all of you, especially John and Jerry, so waking up at this early hour to join us. Lisa had to leave at 5, so she's already gone. She had to teach. Thanks to all the speakers. I see a lot of digital applause now coming up. It's can't hear it, but you can see it. We hope to be in touch on the side of our research project with you in the future, but let's leave it at this for now, and please enjoy your day as it progresses. And hope to see many of you next time in our seminar on comparative political theory of the corporation, June 3rd.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
friends.